wanted more. It began in a town that most people would never hear about, a place where the cornfields stretched wider than the dreams of those who lived there. Fairmount, Indiana. Population, small. Spirit, smaller. In this forgotten corner of America, a restless boy grew up staring at the horizon, certain that somewhere beyond the flat farmlands, life was waiting for him. That boy's name was James Byron Dean. From the very beginning, James carried a quiet fire inside him. He wasn't the loudest in the classroom, nor the strongest on the playground. Yet there was something different about the way he moved, the way his eyes lingered on the world, as if he was searching for something invisible to everyone else. His mother, Mildred, saw it. She nurtured his curiosity, encouraging to paint, to read, to dream. She was the anchor of his young life. But when James was only 9 years old, tragedy struck. Mildred died of cancer, and the boy who had already felt out of place was suddenly untethered. That lost card wound so deep that it became the silent engine of his rebellion. From that day forward, James carried two selves: the charming, smiling boy people thought they knew, and the broken, raging child who felt abandoned by the world. He moved in with his aunt and uncle in Fairmount. On the surface, life seemed stable. He went to school, played basketball, joined the debate team. But inside, he was restless. His classmates dreamed of farming, family, or maybe a factory job in Indianapolis. James dreamed of immortality. James didn't just want to live. He wanted to leave a mark so deep that the world could never erase him. As a teenager, his contradictions grew sharper. He could be tender and poetic one moment, explosive and reckless the next. Teachers labeled him difficult. Friends didn't know if they could trust him or follow him. He smoked when he wasn't supposed to, drove too fast on country roads, and asked questions no one else dared to ask. When graduation came in 1949, James left Indiana behind to live with his father in Los Angeles. To most, it seemed like a practical decision. To James, it was destiny. He was chasing a horizon that only he could see. But Los Angeles was not the glamorous city of dreams he had imagined. It was a brutal place for outsiders, a machine that chewed up the hopeful and spat out the broken. James enrolled at Santa Monica College, then transferred to UCLA to study drama. He survived by working odd jobs, parking cars, carrying crates, waiting tables. Always broke, always hungry, but never giving up. On stage, something miraculous happened. The awkward boy from Indiana disappeared. In his place was a force of nature. Professors noticed it immediately. James didn't act like other students. He didn't pretend. He lived inside the roles. He bled emotion, raw and unfiltered. Watching him was uncomfortable, magnetic, unforgettable. It wasn't long before whispers started. That boy has something untamed, something dangerous. Yet even in his small successes, James was haunted. His father remained distant, never giving the approval he craved. Every role he took on stage was an argument with the world, a desperate plea to be seen, to be understood. He was running from Fairmount, from grief, from himself. By the time he left for New York to pursue theater, James Dean was already carrying the weight of two lives: the small-town boy who never fit in, and the rebel who would one day become the face of a generation. And though he didn't know it yet, his story would not be measured in years lived, but in how fiercely those years burned. A city that tested him. New York City, early 1950s. The streets pulsed with ambition, with young dreamers chasing stages and screens that could make them immortal or destroy them. For James Dean, the city was both battlefield and sanctuary. He arrived with little more than a suitcase and a defiance that burned through every rejection he faced. He was poor, often hungry, living in small apartments with peeling paint and cold floors. But poverty didn't weaken him. It sharpened him. Each night, he walked the streets of Manhattan, staring at the glowing marquees, imagining his name in lights. In the daytime, he studied with the Actors Studio under Lee Strasberg, the temple of method acting. There, James found not just a craft, but a weapon. He was not like the others who politely rehearsed their lines. He ripped his soul open with every performance. When he raged on stage, It was the echo of his childhood wounds. When he cried, it was his mother's absence bleeding out of him. Watching him was unsettling. Some classmates dismiss him as reckless, too raw, but others whisper that greatness was being born. Casting directors, however, were not so easily convinced. James was rejected again and again. He wasn't handsome in the polished Hollywood sense. His teeth were imperfect, his hair unruly, his manner unpredictable. Studios wanted charm. James gave them chaos. They wanted stability. James gave them danger. But slowly, dangerously, his aura began to shift. He landed small roles in television dramas. His presence electric even in fleeting appearances. Something about his face, boyish yet tortured, stayed with audiences. He wasn't just another actor. He was a mirror reflecting every insecurity and longing that people try to hide. At night, in smoky bars and cramped apartments, James debated philosophy with fellow actors, scribbled poetry, and chain-smoked cigarettes until dawn. He lived recklessly, as though time itself was chasing him. Those who knew him said he seemed both fully alive and half in the grave, as if he carried an invisible countdown inside. By 1954, the whispers had grown louder. A rebel was rising in the shadows of Broadway. Too wild to be ignored, too dangerous to be forgotten. His destiny was pulling him toward Hollywood. Not the polished studio system he despised, but something else entirely. James Dean wasn't just preparing to be an actor. He was preparing to change the very language of acting. And soon, the world would notice. The making of a rebel. By the mid-1950s, the world around James Dean was beginning to shift. Television had invaded living rooms. Broadway was glowing with new voices, and Hollywood was looking for the next face of America. But America, still caught between tradition and rebellion, wasn't prepared for someone like James Dean. He was restless in New York, too wild for stage's limits, too impatient to remain a name whispered only in smoky rehearsal halls. When he won a part in the Broadway play See the Jaguar, critics barely noticed production, but they noticed him. The reviews described him as raw, unsettling, impossible to ignore. For James, it was proof that his hunger meant something. Soon after, he took a role in The Immortalist, and this time, the whispers turned into recognition. He wasn't just playing characters. He was becoming them. When James Dean stepped onto a stage, audiences leaned forward, uncomfortable but mesmerized. He gave them the truth they didn't want to see, the anger, the fragility, the loneliness hiding in every heart. It wasn't long before Hollywood began to take notice. Director Elia Kazan, always hunting for the next raw talent, saw in James something dangerous and new, a young actor who could carry the method into cinema and rip apart the polished illusions of the screen. Kazan cast him in East of Eden, a role that would define him. On set, James was unpredictable, infuriating even. He ignored instructions, improvised lines, and clashed with seasoned actors. But what appeared as chaos was, in truth, brilliance. When the cameras rolled, his rebellion became art. His scenes vibrated with authenticity, as if he wasn't pretending at all, but simply existing in front of the lens. In East of Eden, audiences met a different kind of hero, not noble or polished, but wounded, rebellious, aching for love and never receiving it. They weren't watching a movie. They were watching James Dean tear himself open, and in that vulnerability, people saw their own unspoken struggles. The film made him a star overnight. Suddenly, the boy from Fairmount, Indiana, was a face plastered across magazines. The name teenagers whispered in admiration. He was everything America secretly feared and secretly desired. A rebel who refused to bow, a young man who lived by his own rules. But James was not satisfied. Fame was never the goal. He wasn't chasing the applause or the glamour. He was chasing something far more dangerous. Truth. In his second film, Rebel Without a Cause, he gave the world its most unforgettable mirror. As Jim Stark, the troubled teenager, James embodied the frustration of an entire generation. He stood for every boy who fought with his father, every girl who felt misunderstood, every young soul who carried silent rage. The film wasn't just entertainment, it was revolution. And at the center of it all was a young actor who seemed less like a performer and more like a prophet. Behind the camera, though, James lived with the same recklessness that defined his characters. He raced cars at dangerous speeds, smoked endlessly, and loved fiercely but briefly. He was drawn to the edge of everything: art, love, danger, as if ordinary life could never be enough. In just 2 films, he had become more than an actor. He was a symbol. For the restless, the broken, the misunderstood, James Dean was theirs. And yet, even as the spotlight grew brighter, a shadow began to follow him. The world saw him as immortal, but those closest to him whispered a different story, that James Dean was living on borrowed time. The weight of immortality. By 1955, James Dean was no longer just an actor. He was a cultural storm. Rebel Without a Cause had exploded across theaters, and for the first time in American cinema, teenagers saw themselves not as side characters, but as the main story. They saw their confusion, their loneliness, their defiance, and it was all written across James Dean's haunted eyes. In theaters, young men sat in silence, recognizing their own rage in his trembling voice. Young women saw both the tenderness and the danger of a soul too wild to tame. Parents, meanwhile, shifted uncomfortably in their seats, faced with the truth of a generation slipping beyond their control. James Dean had not just acted in a film, he had ignited a revolution. But while the world celebrated him, James felt the weight of something darker. Fame had never been his goal. What he wanted was authenticity, to strip away every mask and live honestly, even if that honesty destroyed him. Yet now, the cameras never stopped flashing. He became a prisoner of his own image. The rebel, the outsider, the boy who refused to bow. On the set of Giant, his final film, this tension only deepened. Acting alongside legends like Elizabeth Taylor and Rock Hudson, James was once again the unpredictable storm. He clashed with Hudson's polished professionalism, disappearing from rehearsals, showing up late, refusing to repeat lines the same way twice. To some, he was reckless. To others, he was genius. But when the cameras rolled, he delivered scenes so powerful, so human, that even his critics could not deny it. His portrayal of Jet Rink, the poor ranch hand who rises to power, was haunting. It wasn't just a character. It was James Dean himself. Ambitious, restless, consumed by demons no success could silence. Elizabeth Taylor, who grew close to him during filming, saw the truth beneath his rebellion. She later said he carried a sadness that never left him, even when he laughed. He was magnetic, yes, but also fragile, like glass under pressure. Away from the set, James fed another hunger: speed. He had fallen in love with racing, with the roar of engines, the blur of landscapes, the thin line between life and death. Cars gave him what acting could not: control over his fate, a chance to push himself to the very edge. Friends warned him, begged him to slow down. But slowing down was something James Dean never knew how to do. Everywhere he went, crowds followed. His face appeared on magazine covers. His name echoed across the country. He was America's new icon. Yet inside, James felt the same emptiness that had haunted him since childhood. No amount of fame, no applause, no role could heal the wound left by his mother's death, or fill the void of father's distant love. To the world, James Dean was immortal. To himself, he was still that boy from Indiana, lonely, searching, running against time. And time, though he didn't yet know it, was running out faster than he could imagine. Racing against time. Hollywood adored him. Teenagers worshipped him. Directors feared and respected him. But for James Dean, the stage lights and the applause were never enough. Acting consumed his soul, but something else set his blood on fire: speed. James had discovered racing not as a hobby, but as a necessity. Behind the wheel, he felt free in a way the world could never give him. The roar of the engine drowned out the noise of his fame, the pain of his past, the loneliness that lingered even in crowded rooms. Driving wasn't just a thrill. It was the only place where he could breathe. In early 1955, he bought a Porsche Speedster and began entering amateur races. To the world, it was dangerous indulgence. To James, it was salvation. On the track, he wasn't James Dean, the movie star. He was just a man in his machine, locked in a battle with gravity, wind, and death itself. But there was something ominous about the way he approached it. He didn't drive like a man chasing victory. He drove like a man chasing fate. Friends would later recall the unease they felt watching behind the wheel. His focus too sharp, his hunger too reckless. They begged him to stop, to slow down, to choose life over speed. He only smiled, that crooked smile that seemed to say, "You don't understand, I was never meant to grow old." Between film shoots, he devoted himself to racing. He studied engines, obsessed over mechanics, pushed his cars to their limits. His Porsche 550 Spider became his new obsession. Sleek, silver, beautiful, and deadly. He christened it with a nickname that felt more like prophecy: Little Bastard. Hollywood executives were horrified. They tried to ban him from racing, fearing their new star would destroy himself before the studio could cash in on his brilliance. Warner Brothers even forced him to take a break while shooting Giant. But when filming wrapped, James returned to the track with the same intensity as before, as if he had been holding his breath too long. By September 1955, he was preparing for a race in Salinas. The Porsche was tuned, the road was calling, and James was restless. He drove it to the streets of Los Angeles, the metallic beast reflecting the sun, onlookers staring in awe and fear. One friend, the actor Alec Guinness, famously warned him after seeing the car, "If you get in that car, you'll be dead within a week." James only laughed. The days ahead would prove how thin the line between prophecy and fate truly is. Because James Dean wasn't just racing cars anymore. He was racing time itself. The Last Drive, September 30th, 1955. The morning began like any other in Los Angeles. But for James Dean, there was a tension in the air, like the world itself was holding its breath. He had just finished filming Giant, his third and final movie. Hollywood wanted him to settle down, to prepare for the avalanche of fame that was about to crown him the brightest star of his generation. But James had other plans. That day, he wasn't an actor or an icon or a myth in the making. He was simply a man with his car, the silver Porsche 550 Spider he called Little Bastard. Sleek, dangerous, alive with the promise of speed. He had planned to trailer the car to a race in Salinas, but at the last minute, he decided to drive it himself. "She needs to be broken in," he told his mechanic, Rolf Wudrich, who would ride beside him. The decision, casual as it seemed, was the pivot on which history would turn. Before leaving, James stopped by the studio. Some crew members waved, joking about his obsession with racing. Others looked at the car with unease. The warning from Alec Guinness just days earlier still lingered in the air. "If you get in that car, you'll be dead within a week." James had laughed it off, but those who saw him that morning couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. By early afternoon, James and Rolf set out. Behind them, a Ford station wagon carried friends and support crew. The Porsche gleamed in the California sun, its engine roaring as James pushed it down the open highway. Witnesses later remembered the car as a blur of silver, flying past them like it carried some urgency no one else could see. They stopped once for coffee in Bakersfield. James relaxed, cracked jokes with fans who recognized him. He seemed calm, even cheerful. No one could have guessed that the clock was already running out. As the hours passed, the road to Salinas stretched long and lonely. Twilight was settling in, painting the sky with streaks of red and gold. James loved this time of day, the shadows lengthening, the world caught between light and darkness. He shifted gears, the Porsche surging forward, alive beneath his hands. But fate was waiting. Near the junction of Route 466 and Route 41, a young driver in a Ford Tudor turned left across the highway, directly into James's path. There was no time, no space, no miracle. At 85 miles per hour, the Porsche struck with force that shattered metal, glass, and destiny. Rolf was thrown clear, broken but alive. James, however, never stood a chance. The boy who had lived like a flame, who had carried the hopes and fears of a generation, was gone before the ambulance even arrived. He was just 24 years old, the rebel who burned brighter than anyone else had burned out too soon. And in that silence, America lost not just an actor, but a piece of its innocence. The world stopped. News traveled slowly in 1955. There was no internet, no social media, just radios, telephones, and the morning papers. But when the words finally spread across America, it was as if the entire nation had gasped at once. James Dean, Hollywood's rising star, killed in a car crash. The country froze. In diners and classrooms, in factories, in quiet living rooms, people stared in disbelief. How could it be? He was just beginning. Just days earlier, his face had been on magazine covers, his voice echoing through theaters, his future stretching wider than anyone could imagine. And now, silence in New York, where James had once walked the streets as an anonymous dreamer. Fans gathered in clusters, stunned, unwilling to accept it. In Los Angeles, the studios scrambled, unsure of how to handle the sudden loss of their brightest star. And in Indiana, the small town he once longed to escape was suddenly overwhelmed by grief-stricken visitors who wanted to see where the boy had come from. But it wasn't just sadness. It was something sharper, something heavier. James Dean was only 24. His death felt less like the passing of man and more like the theft of possibility itself. The roles he would never play, the words he would never speak, the life he would never live. It was all stolen in an instant. And that was precisely why he became immortal. As the weeks passed, his films, East of Eden, Rebel Without a Cause, Giant, transformed from movies into sacred texts. Audiences watched them not just for entertainment, but for communion with a ghost. Every time his face appeared on screen, it was a resurrection. Every line he delivered was a reminder of what had been lost. Teenagers saw in him the ultimate symbol of their own rebellion. He hadn't just acted out their frustration. He had lived it, and he had died young enough to remain forever one of them. Adults, meanwhile, were haunted by the thought of a child lost too soon, a brilliance extinguished before it could mature. Hollywood scrambled to preserve his image. Photographs, interviews, and unfinished footage were combed over like relics. Critics began calling him a legend, even though his career had lasted less than 3 years. He had starred in only 3 major films, yet his impact eclipsed actors with decades-long resumes. Around the world, murals began to appear. His face, with a cigarette dangling from his lips and that faraway stare, became a universal language of rebellion. From Paris cafes to Tokyo alleyways, James Dean was more than an actor. He was a patron saint of youth, of defiance, of the hunger to live faster than time allowed. And so, his death did not end the story. It multiplied it. James Dean did not simply fade from the world. He became larger than life, untouchable, eternal. But for those who had truly known him, Elizabeth Taylor, Rock Hudson, his family back in Fairmount, the grief was intimate and crushing. They had not lost an icon. They had lost a fragile, complicated young man, a boy who had loved too fiercely, raced too recklessly, and longed too desperately for meaning. In the weeks after his funeral, as the world began to mythologize him, one truth lingered in the hearts of those closest to him. James Dean had lived like a flame, and like every flame, he was destined to burn out, yet even ashes can cast light. The flame that never died. The years moved on, but the image of James Dean never faded. While other stars aged, reinvented themselves, or slipped quietly into history, James remained untouched, forever 24, forever the rebel with the wounded eyes and the crooked smile. For every generation that followed, he became more than a memory. He became a mirror. Teenagers in the 1960s, protesting war and tradition, saw themselves in his restless defiance. Dreamers in the 1970s, chasing freedom on open highways, felt his spirit in the roar of their engines. Artists, musicians, and actors across decades invoked his name like a prayer. Bob Dylan carried his photograph. Elvis Presley studied his performances. Even decades later, the raw vulnerability James poured onto film continued to ripple through art, music, and culture. And still, the question lingered. Why him? Why James Dean? The answer lies not in the 3 films he made, but in the life he lived between them. He was not polished, not safe, not designed for perfection. He was messy, reckless, fragile, and painfully human. On screen, he did what few dared to do. He told the truth, and the truth, once revealed, cannot be forgotten. Visitors still travel to Fairmount, Indiana, to stand by his grave, leaving flowers, cigarettes, notes scribbled with the words, "You changed me." Highways in California still carry whispers of the boy in the silver Porsche, racing not just toward a finish line, but into legend. His face still stares down from posters, unchanged, defiant, eternal. In Hollywood, new stars rise and fall. Names that once filled theaters vanish from memory. But James Dean does not vanish. His myth only deepens, his shadow stretching longer across time. He remains what he always was, a reminder that life is fragile, that brilliance often burns fastest, and that sometimes the ones who leave too soon never truly leave at all. James Dean once said, "Dream as if you'll live forever, live as if you'll die today." And that is exactly what he did. He dreamed like eternity belonged to him. He lived like every heartbeat could be the last. And though his life was cut short on a lonely California highway, his flame did not die that night. It simply spread into the hearts of millions who found themselves in his story. James Dean was not meant to grow old. He was meant to remain forever young, forever a rebel, forever immortal. Some stories are not just about the past. They are mirrors of our own lives. James Dean's flame may have gone out on that lonely highway, but his spirit continues to burn in every soul that refuses to live by the rules. If this story touched you, if it made you feel, remember, there are countless more untold stories waiting here. Subscribe to Silent Stories and join us as we uncover the legends, the secrets, and the voices that time tried to silence. Don't just watch history, be part of it.